The Korean War, or United Nations police action, has been called the Forgotten War, and if that's the case, the final phase of that war, from the summer of 1951 until the armistice was signed in 1953, can be called the forgotten part of the Forgotten War. Both sides were dragging along the peace negotiations in the village of Panmunjom, while just a few miles north, the militaries were fighting for small advantages in an almost static war. While the home front wearied of war and largely moved on, soldiers and marines and sailors continued to fight and to die and to perform extraordinary acts of bravery. In a forgotten battle of a forgotten part of the forgotten war, one such act deserves to be remembered. The naming of locations by United Nations forces in the Korean War can sometimes seem odd. Why were there names like Kansas and Siberia used in a war in the Far East? In fact, most positions had generic names like Hill 122, but also colloquial names that made it easier to clarify positions. It might have been more common because it eased communication as UN forces were multinational. Some names were simply descriptive. The 1953 Battle of Pork Chop Hill was fought over an outpost atop a hill, shaped like a pork chop. It isn't clear exactly how the Jamestown Line got its name, except that it is thought to likely have been named by United States Marines. After large operations exhausted themselves with the Chinese Spring Offensive in April and May of 1951 and the UN counterattack in June and July, the conflict turned into a relatively static war of attrition and trench warfare, more resembling the First World War than the wild swings of the earlier part of the Korean War. David J. Berkusen of the University of Calgary explained in the journal Canadian Military History in 1998. Barbed wire, artillery duels, patrolling in no man's land, static warfare from fixed defensive positions. This description could easily fit the Western Front in 1916. In fact, however, it also depicts the Jamestown Line in central Korea from the beginning of the static phase of the Korean War in late October 1951 to the ceasefire of July 1953. In fact, the Jamestown Line was part of what was called the Main Line of Resistance, or MLR, a line across the peninsula established by the United Nations as the line to hold back Chinese and North Korean forces. Military History, a website of the Canadian Historical Association, writes, the Jamestown Line stretched across rugged mountainous terrain near the 38th parallel, the border that had initially divided North and South Korea before the conflict began. As the war settled into a defensive phase, this line became the UN's primary barrier against further incursions from Chinese forces, effectively marking the boundary between the two Koreas. Berkusen explains, the line was more than a defensive position. It was a declaration of the UN's determination to prevent any further territorial losses, a barrier that had to be held at all costs. The stalemate was both military, both sides have come to the conclusion that outright victory was no longer possible, and political, as peace talks limited the size of actions. Berkusen writes, when the Panmunjom phase of the Korean armistice talks began on 25 October 1951, political limits to further military action in Korea were established. From then on, neither side would fight for outright victory. But that didn't mean, however, that conflict didn't continue, as Berkusen writes. Indeed, both sides would maneuver for favorable position along a more or less predetermined line of contact, and at a cost of thousands of lives. These battles took place within an almost bizarre set of rules that would become characteristic of the hot fighting of the Cold War. In his memoir, Matthew Ridgway, Supreme Commander of United Nations forces in Korea in the late fall of 1951, explained the limits dictated to James Van Fleet, commanding the U.S. Eighth Army. With the resumption of truce negotiations, I instructed Van Fleet to assume an active defense, giving him authority to seize suitable terrain along the general trace of his present lines, but limiting offensive operations to the taking of outpost positions requiring commitment of no more than one division. This meant that the war would be fought over, essentially, hills, along a line that was not expected to change. Military history explains. The geography of the Jamestown Line was formidable. Steep hills, narrow valleys, and ridgelines provided vantage points but also exposed soldiers to the elements and to enemy fire. Each hill and trench became a critical position. Among the many forces defending the Jamestown Line was the U.S. 1st Marine Division. Military historian Bernard C. Nolte explains in U.S. Marines in the Korean War, a 2007 publication of the History Division of the United States Marine Corps. The move there, in March 1952, confirmed a shift to position warfare. Instead of making amphibious landings at Incheon or Wonsan or seizing ground either to break out of encirclement or to advance, the division had the mission of defending its portion of the Jamestown Line and preparing to counterattack as ordered to contain or eliminate any Chinese penetration. The Marines defended that line by building bunkers. Leatherneck magazine explained in 2017. One of 1st Marine Division's first tasks in taking over its sector of the main line of resistance, dubbed the Jamestown Line, was the establishment of a combat outpost line, COPL, designed to break up any Chinese attack against the MLR. Nolte writes the Jamestown Line had become, in the words of Marine Corporal Robert Hall, who fought there, a messy, rambling series of ditches 5 to 7 feet deep that linked a succession of bunkers constructed of sandbags and timber and used for shelter or fighting. The trenches wandered erratically to prevent Chinese attackers who penetrated the perimeter from delivering deadly enfilade fire along the lengthy straight segments. Life along the line was always dangerous. Nolte writes that the enemy maintained pressure on the United Nations forces. He probed the line of combat outposts. Marines also engaged in probes, patrols, and ambushes. Artillery and mortar attacks were constant as both sides jockeyed for position that might give leverage in the ongoing truce talks. Even the bunkers offered limited protection, as Nolte explains. As for the bunkers themselves, since piles of trash, ration cards, scrap paper, and protruding stovepipes revealed their location, the enemy must have known where every bunker was. A bunker, therefore, could easily become a death trap. Leatherneck magazine explains most of these outposts were quickly, if unofficially, dubbed by Marines with names of famous motion picture and TV stars: Hetty, Dagmar, Marilyn, Esther, and Ingrid, while others reflected names in the news: Siberia, Warsaw, Berlin, and East Berlin. The outpost called Siberia, officially Hill 58A, would become a contested point in the summer of 1952. The squad-sized outpost was taken by the Chinese in an attack shortly after midnight on August 9th. This was a problem, Nolte explains. Siberia lay midway between the Marine main line of resistance and the line of Chinese outposts. The enemy's possession of Siberia would provide observation posts to adjust artillery and mortar fire against the nearest segment of the Jamestown Line. The Marines counterattacked, but were driven back by Chinese artillery and mortars. The Marines called in their own artillery and airstrikes. Marines retook the hill only to face a massive artillery bombardment that Nolte estimates at over 5,000 shells, driving the Marines back again. The barrage, Nolte writes, wounded or killed perhaps 3/4 of the Marines who had attacked Siberia on the morning of 9 August. Another company again retook the hill, only to be driven off by a Chinese counterattack at dawn. Nolte writes the losses suffered by the 1st Marines, 17 killed and 243 wounded within 30 hours, convinced Colonel Layer that his regiment could not hold Siberia if Hill 122, nicknamed Bunker Hill, remained in Chinese hands. Sam Summerlin of the Associated Press witnessed the fight for Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill is an insignificant dot on the war map of Korea, yet is of tactical value in the sort of hill-to-hill fighting that is the war in Korea today. Why is Bunker Hill important? Major General John T. Selden, boss of the 1st Marine Division, explained, "On the hill we can look right into their positions." Nolte writes that Colonel Layer and his staff planned a sudden thrust at Bunker Hill, possession of which would enable his command to dominate Siberia and observe movement beyond the Chinese outpost line. The Marines made a diversionary attack on Siberia, using tanks mounted with searchlights or flamethrowers. The searchlights would highlight a target in a brief burst of illumination and then pound them with 90mm tank rounds, while the flamethrowing tanks climbed Siberia, using bursts of flame to light their way while demoralizing the defenders, and gained the crest before doubling back towards Marine lines. While this was happening, a surprise assault was being made by Company B of the 1st Battalion of the 1st Marines, commanded by Captain Sereno S. Scranton, Jr. With them was Navy hospitalman John Edward Kilmer. The website of the United States Marine Corps writes John Edward Jackie Kilmer was born in Highland Park, Illinois on 15 August 1930. He quit high school at age 17 to join the U.S. Navy on 16 August 1947. He enlisted as an apprentice seaman at the Navy Recruiting Station, Houston, Texas, and trained at Naval Hospital Corps School, San Diego, California. After graduation in April 1948, he advanced in rate to hospital apprentice, then to hospitalman on 1st September 1950. The Department of Defense website writes that when the Korean War broke out, his 4-year stint as a sailor was almost up, but he wanted to put his medical training to good use, and so he re-enlisted in August 1951. But Kilmer had an undisclosed dispute with a superior officer at some point after re-enlisting. Because of that, he asked for a transfer to the Fleet Marine Force, which provides support to Marines during action and reconnaissance operations. After completing field medical school, Kilmer was transferred to duty as a hospital corpsman attached to the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division. Petty Officer First Class David Calmel explained in a 2022 article of the Defense Visual Information Distribution Service. "Welcome to hell," were the first words that greeted a young Marine, Joseph Barna, on top of a mountain in Korea as Kilmer walked up and introduced himself. The two formed a friendship after that meeting in April 1952. "I served with John for 4 months in Korea," Barna told Colmel, "and in those 4 months I found a friendship that no one could describe, believe me." Barna said he would help Kilmer on his patrols looking for wounded and killed Marines in between firefights. "A Navy corpsman's job was to try to save as many young men as he could," said Barna. "They worked 24 hours a day, and their pay was to see a wounded Marine live. I can never imagine how many young heroes came home to their families because of a corpsman. How many Marines said, because of a doc, I was given a second chance to live." Barna knew that firsthand. "I owe Jackie Kilmer my life. I was wounded in battle one night while carrying a 68-pound flamethrower. I was thrown to the ground and it landed on my back, the flamethrower pinning me to the ground," said Barna. "A Korean came at me with his bayonet. I can still see his face and smell the garlic of his breath. He lunged at me. I turned to the side and he struck his bayonet through my left arm. As I lay there bleeding, I began to feel tired from the loss of blood." Barna continued, "I was ready to close my eyes when I heard a familiar voice say, 'Joe, if I don't close that wound, you'll die. God doesn't want to take you yet.' Jackie found me in the chaos. He took off my flamethrower and carried me to a bunker. He sewed my wound shut after treating it." Company B was in need of a corpsman the night of the attack on Bunker Hill, having lost 2 in combat. It wasn't his unit, but Kilmer volunteered to go along on the attack. The attack succeeded. The Chinese were caught off guard and the Marines took the hill. Nolte writes, "In the wake of the assault force, other Marines and members of the Korean Service Corps manhandled sandbags, wire, and shovels up the hill to help Company B organize the defenses of the objective against the counterattack that was certain to come. The Marines did the best they could to prepare," Nolte writes, as daylight faded into dusk on 12 August. "The Marines defending the reverse slope of Bunker Hill struggled to improve their hurriedly prepared fortifications, for the Chinese preferred to counterattack under cover of darkness. When the attack came, it was brutal," Summerlin reported. "For sheer ferocity, the Battle of Bunker Hill ranks high with the Marines. The Leathernecks endured savage artillery and mortar fire." The Department of Defense website writes, "Shortly after midnight, large swaths of the enemy forces started assaulting the rifle company with mortar, artillery, and sniper fire. Kilmer moved from one position to another, helping wounded Marines and carrying many men to safety, despite putting himself in harm's way." Summerlin reported that Marine Lieutenant Colonel Gerard Armitage estimated that 10 to 15,000 rounds dropped in a spot of 1,000-yard square. The Marine Corps website reads, "During battle, Hospitalman Kilmer repeatedly braved enemy fire to reach wounded Marines and render aid, carrying many to safety. He defied warnings of danger and started crawling towards a seriously wounded Marine who was lying in the open field. Mortar fragments struck Hospitalman Kilmer, but he continued crawling until he reached the wounded man." The Department of Defense website continues, "Halfway to the man he was trying to rescue, Kilmer was badly wounded by mortar fragments. However, he continued on, inching toward the man despite all the enemy shells falling around him. Kilmer started to give the Marine first aid when another barrage of fire exploded. Thinking only of his patient, Kilmer threw himself over the other Marine to form a human shield. In doing so, the young corpsman was hit by flying shrapnel." John E. Kilmer did not survive his wounds, but the unnamed Marine he shielded did. Kilmer died 2 days short of his 22nd birthday. The battle continued through the 16th. Summerlin writes, "The Marines and Chinese fought with every weapon and their fists. The Marines used their own artillery, with Nolte noting that the 11th Marines fired 10,652 shells in the 24 hours ending at 1800 on 13 August, a volume not exceeded until the final months of the war in 1953. More attacks kept coming. Nolte writes, "The succession of Marine companies that took over Bunker Hill had to repel 7 attacks before the end of the war. One particularly determined attack the night of August 25th to 26th cost the Marines 48 killed, 313 seriously wounded, and hundreds of others who suffered minor wounds. But it was worse for the Chinese." Nolte notes that the number of known Chinese dead exceeded 400, and total casualties may have numbered 3,200. The month ended with Bunker Hill in Marine hands. Noting the close proximity to the village of Panmunjom, where peace talks were ongoing, Summerlin remarked, "War and peace merge in weird and tragic fashion in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill is a symbol of the brand of warfare that prevails today, and that likely will continue until the Panmunjom talks succeed or fail." The talks dragged on. It isn't clear exactly what finally drew them to a close. Perhaps the death of Joseph Stalin in March of 1953, causing a distracted Soviet Union to stop supporting the war. Perhaps, some authors argue, the U.S. testing of the W-9 nuclear artillery shell. But an armistice agreement, although no formal peace treaty, was finally agreed upon on July 27, 1953. 20 days before that happened, Secretary of the Navy Robert B. Anderson presented the Medal of Honor, posthumously awarded to hospitalman John Edward Kilmer, to his mother, Mrs. Lois B. Kilmer, of San Antonio. After reading the medal citation, which concluded, "He gallantly gave his life for another," Secretary Anderson told Lois Kilmer, "Your son served so honorably and so well." But sadly, heroes are often forgotten. In 2024, the San Antonio Express wrote that as the decades passed, the young medic's heroism became a whisper in the wind as his parents and contemporaries died. But in 2006, a small group of San Antonio veterans started marking his passing, and in 2017, Joseph Barna attended that memorial. He said, "I owe 70 years of my life to a 21-year-old Navy corpsman who died days short of his 22nd birthday. I could have died when I was 22. A forgotten battle in a forgotten part of a forgotten war." Summerlin wrote, "On the broad canvas of war, Bunker Hill cuts a small figure. How many have fought, performed extraordinary acts of bravery, and died on such a hill." In 2019, Secretary of the Navy Richard B. Spencer announced that a new U.S. Navy Arleigh Burke-class destroyer would be named USS John E. Kilmer. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.